Imagine federal investigators showing up at your childhood best friend's door, asking detailed questions about your finances, your drinking habits, your relationships, and whether you've ever said anything critical about the U.S. government. Then imagine them visiting your ex-girlfriend from college, your former roommate, your high school teacher, and your neighbor from 3 addresses ago, all without you knowing exactly what's being asked or what's being said about you. This isn't a dystopian nightmare or a plot from a spy thriller. This is the reality of security clearance background investigations that over 4 million Americans undergo when applying for jobs that require access to classified information. The government claims these investigations protect national security by ensuring that people with access to secrets can be trusted. But how much of this process is about genuine security concerns, and how much is about compiling unprecedented levels of personal information on citizens who just want to serve their country? By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how deep these investigations go, what they're really looking for, and why the security clearance system raises profound questions about privacy, power, and whether we're protecting secrets or building surveillance infrastructure that could be misused. Let's pull back the curtain on one of the government's most invasive and least understood processes. Let me introduce you to James Mitchell, because his experience with the security clearance process reveals both how the system works and the disturbing questions it raises. James was a software engineer living in Seattle, working for a private tech company, when he was recruited by a defense contractor to work on cybersecurity systems for the Department of Defense. The job offered significantly better pay, interesting technical challenges, and the opportunity to do work he considered meaningful for national security. There was just one catch. The position required a top-secret security clearance with sensitive compartmented information access, one of the highest levels of clearance short of the most restricted classifications. James had never been in trouble with the law, had good credit, no drug use history, and no foreign contacts that would raise concerns. He assumed the background investigation would be straightforward. Maybe they'd verify his employment history, check his criminal record, and that would be it. He had no idea what he was actually signing up for. The process began with James filling out the SF-86 form, officially called the Questionnaire for National Security Positions. This isn't a simple employment application. It's a 127-page document that asks for an exhaustive accounting of your entire adult life. James had to list every place he'd lived for the past 10 years, including exact addresses and the names of people who could verify his residency. He had to provide details on every job he'd held, including reasons for leaving and contact information for supervisors. He had to list every school he'd attended going back to high school. He had to disclose all foreign travel, including dates, purposes, and people he'd met. He had to provide information about immediate family members, including their citizenships, employment, and any foreign contacts. He had to answer detailed questions about his finances, debts, assets, bankruptcies, late payments. He had to disclose any mental health treatment, any drug or alcohol use, any arrests or criminal activity, even if charges were dropped. But the SF-86 was just the beginning. What James didn't fully understand when he submitted that form was that he'd just given the government permission to conduct what amounts to one of the most comprehensive investigations into a private citizen's life that exists in American society. Over the next 8 months, federal investigators with the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency would interview dozens of people from James's past, pull records he didn't even know existed, and compile a file on him that would include intimate details about his personal life, his beliefs, his relationships, and his behavior going back years. The investigation would reveal things about himself that James had forgotten and uncover what other people really thought about him, information that would determine whether he could have the career he wanted. According to the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, the government conducts approximately 2.5 million background investigations annually for security clearances at various levels. These investigations fall into different tiers depending on the level of access being granted. A confidential clearance requires a national agency check with local agency checks and credit check. A secret clearance requires a more extensive investigation going back 7 years. But the most invasive investigations are for top-secret clearances like James was pursuing, which go back 10 years and involve in-person interviews with neighbors, friends, colleagues, family members, and anyone else who might have information about the applicant's character, loyalty, and trustworthiness. The stated purpose is to identify any factors that could make someone vulnerable to coercion, blackmail, or foreign influence, protecting national security by ensuring cleared personnel can be trusted with secrets. But here's where it gets complicated. The actual criteria for what disqualifies someone for a clearance are vague and subjective, applied inconsistently by adjudicators who have enormous discretionary power and often seem to have more to do with conformity and conventional morality than with actual security risks. The 13 adjudicative guidelines that clearance decisions are based on include factors like foreign influence, financial considerations, personal conduct, and allegiance to the United States. But in practice, people have been denied clearances for having too much credit card debt, for having a foreign-born spouse, for seeking mental health treatment for depression, for admitting to marijuana use years earlier even in states where it's now legal, for being in polyamorous relationships, and for expressing political views that investigators deemed concerning. The process isn't just about security. It's about judgment of your entire life and whether you fit a narrow definition of trustworthiness that often reflects biases and outdated moral standards. James's investigation began with a credit check that pulled his full financial history, every bank account, credit card, loan, and financial transaction that left a paper trail. Investigators looked for patterns that might indicate financial stress or desperation that could make him vulnerable to bribery or blackmail. They examined his tax returns for accuracy and consistency. They reviewed his social media accounts, not just recent posts, but everything going back years, looking for concerning patterns, foreign contacts, or statements that might indicate divided loyalty or poor judgment. This part of the investigation happened without James knowing exactly what was being examined or how it was being interpreted. He'd given general consent on the SF-86, but he had no oversight into what investigators were actually accessing or how they were evaluating what they found. Then came the interviews. Federal investigators started contacting people from James's life, conducting what are called subject interviews with people who'd known him at different stages. They spoke with his current neighbors, asking whether James seemed stable, whether they'd observed any concerning behavior, whether he had frequent visitors or seemed to have financial problems. They interviewed his former landlord, asking about his payment history and whether he'd caused any problems. They contacted his current and former employers, asking supervisors about his performance, reliability, and any disciplinary issues. They spoke with his college roommate, asking about his social habits, drug use, drinking, and relationships during those years. They interviewed his ex-girlfriend from 5 years earlier, asking about the nature of their relationship, reasons for the breakup, and whether she had concerns about his character or judgment. These interviews followed a standard protocol, but left enormous room for subjective interpretation. Investigators were trained to identify concerning patterns: financial irresponsibility, alcohol abuse, foreign contacts, instability, anger issues, poor judgment. But they were also evaluating more subtle factors like whether the person seemed loyal to the United States, whether they had unconventional lifestyle choices that might make them vulnerable to blackmail, whether they seemed psychologically stable and reliable. The problem is that these judgments were being made by investigators who brought their own biases and assumptions to the evaluation, and the people being interviewed were answering questions without legal counsel present and often without fully understanding how their responses might be interpreted or weaponized. James's friend Marcus, for example, was interviewed by investigators and asked a series of questions that seemed designed to elicit negative information. They asked whether James had ever expressed criticism of the U.S. government. Marcus, trying to be honest and complete, mentioned that James had criticized certain government policies during political discussions, normal conversation among friends discussing current events. But in the investigator's report, this was documented as "subject has expressed anti-government sentiments," a characterization that suggested something far more concerning than having political opinions. Marcus was asked about James's drinking habits and mentioned that James occasionally had a few beers when they hung out. The report noted, "Associates report subject consumes alcohol," without context about frequency or amount, leaving it open to interpretation as potentially problematic. Marcus was asked if James had any foreign friends, and he mentioned that James had a co-worker from India. The report documented this as a foreign contact, that would require additional investigation, even though it was simply a normal workplace friendship with a legal immigrant colleague. This pattern, where normal behavior was documented in ways that could seem concerning when stripped of context, repeated across multiple interviews. James's ex-girlfriend was asked why their relationship ended, and she gave an honest answer. They'd grown apart and wanted different things. But the investigators' report characterized this as relationship instability, suggesting a pattern of failed relationships that might indicate poor judgment or psychological issues. James's neighbor mentioned that James sometimes worked late at night, which was documented as irregular hours and behavior, potentially suggesting secretive activities rather than the reality of software development deadlines. Each piece of information, individually innocent and explainable, was being compiled into a file where the cumulative impression could be far more negative than the reality of James's life. The investigation lasted 8 months, during which James was in limbo. He couldn't start his new job without the clearance, but he also couldn't know exactly what was being discovered or said about him. He wasn't present for the interviews with his friends, neighbors, and family. He wasn't able to provide context or correct mischaracterizations. He had limited visibility into what records were being pulled or how information was being interpreted. The power imbalance was total. The government had complete access to his life, while he had almost no transparency into what they were finding or concluding. According to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence's 2023 annual report, the average time to complete a top-secret investigation is 163 days, with significant variation depending on complexity. During this time, applicants exist in a state of uncertainty, unable to move forward with their careers and unable to defend themselves against undisclosed concerns. Finally, James received notice that his clearance had been granted and he could start his position. He felt relieved, but also unsettled by the process he'd just gone through. He'd learned things about what people had said about him during investigator interviews. Some friends mentioned conversations they'd had with investigators, and not all of the characterizations were accurate or fair. He'd had his entire life examined by strangers with enormous power over his future, and he'd never had the opportunity to confront the evidence or cross-examine the sources. The investigation had been justified as necessary for national security, but James couldn't shake the feeling that it was also about something else, about the government's desire to know everything about people who might have access to information, to identify not just security risks, but anyone who might be ideologically unreliable or who might question government actions if they learned things through classified access that troubled their conscience. But not everyone who goes through the security clearance process has James's positive outcome. Let me tell you about Sarah Chun, whose experience reveals the darker side of how these investigations can destroy careers and lives. Sarah was a Chinese-American analyst working for the State Department, brilliant at her job, fluent in Mandarin, and invaluable for diplomatic work involving China. She'd been born in the United States, had never lived in China, and had passed multiple security clearance investigations earlier in her career. But when she applied for a higher-level clearance that would give her access to more sensitive intelligence, her application triggered a more intensive investigation that focused heavily on her ethnicity and her family's background. Investigators interviewed Sarah multiple times, asking detailed questions about her parents' immigration from China decades earlier, about relatives she'd never met who still lived in China, about her views on Chinese government policies, and about whether she felt any loyalty to China despite having been born and raised in America. The questions crossed the line from security inquiry into racial profiling. Sarah was being asked to defend her loyalty to the United States in ways that white colleagues with European ancestry would never face. She was asked whether she'd ever felt discriminated against as an Asian American, and when she honestly acknowledged that she had experienced racism, this was documented as evidence of possible resentment toward the United States that could make her a security risk. She was asked about her political views on U.S.-China relations, and her nuanced answers, acknowledging complexity in the relationship rather than expressing unconditional hostility toward China, were interpreted as concerning ambivalence about whether China was an adversary. Sarah's clearance was ultimately denied based on foreign influence, concerns related to her Chinese heritage, despite her having no actual contacts with the Chinese government and no divided loyalties. The denial effectively ended her career at State Department because the work she specialized in required the clearance she'd been denied. She appealed the decision, but the appeals process is heavily weighted in favor of the government. Applicants have limited ability to see the evidence against them or to cross-examine sources, and adjudicators are given enormous deference to make subjective judgments about loyalty and trustworthiness. Sarah's appeal was denied, and she left government service. Her career derailed not because of anything she'd done wrong, but because of assumptions and stereotypes about her ethnicity. According to a 2022 study by the Asian American Government Executives Network, Asian Americans face disproportionately high rates of security clearance denials and face more intensive scrutiny during background investigations compared to white applicants, particularly when the investigations involve perceived adversary nations like China. This pattern raises serious questions about whether security clearance investigations are being used not just to protect secrets, but to enforce racial profiling and to exclude people whose loyalties are questioned based on their ethnicity rather than their actual conduct. The security clearance system, ostensibly designed to be objective and focused on behavior rather than identity, appears to replicate and amplify existing biases about who can be trusted with national secrets. The privacy implications of security clearance investigations extend beyond the individual applicants. When you undergo a background investigation, you're not just consenting to scrutiny of your own life. You're potentially exposing everyone you know to government questioning and record searches. Your friends, family members, roommates, and colleagues can be interviewed without their consent simply because they know you. Your landlords, neighbors, and employers can be contacted and asked for information about you. Your financial institutions, schools, and healthcare providers can be required to turn over records. The investigation creates a surveillance net that captures not just you, but your entire social network, and none of these people have the opportunity to refuse participation or to know how the information they provide will be used. This raises troubling questions about consent and privacy in a democratic society. When James's friend Marcus was interviewed by investigators, he didn't have the option to refuse. If he declined to cooperate, that would have been noted in James's file as a concerning factor, potentially harming James's clearance application. Marcus had to answer questions about his friend's private life, political views, and personal behavior, effectively being conscripted into a government investigation without compensation and without protection for the information he was required to provide. The same dynamic played out with dozens of people in James's life, each of whom was pulled into a government investigation they hadn't consented to and couldn't opt out of. This expanding surveillance, where investigating one person requires collecting information about dozens or hundreds of others, means that the security clearance system touches far more Americans than the 4 million who actually apply for clearances each year. The mental health provisions of security clearance investigations are particularly concerning and counterproductive. Applicants are required to disclose mental health treatment, including therapy and medications, going back years. The stated purpose is to identify conditions that might impair judgment or make someone vulnerable to coercion. But the practical effect is to discourage people from seeking mental health treatment because they fear it will be used against them in clearance adjudications. Multiple studies have found that cleared personnel often avoid seeking help for depression, anxiety, PTSD, or other treatable conditions specifically because they're afraid of losing their clearances and their careers. This creates a perverse situation where the security clearance system may actually be reducing national security by ensuring that people with access to sensitive information don't get help for psychological issues that could impair their judgment. Consider the case of Michael Torres, an Air Force intelligence analyst who deployed to Afghanistan and returned with symptoms of PTSD, nightmares, hypervigilance, difficulty sleeping. Michael knew he should seek treatment, but he also knew that mental health treatment would be flagged during his next clearance renewal. He'd seen colleagues lose their clearances after seeking therapy, their careers destroyed even though they'd done the responsible thing by getting help. So Michael didn't seek treatment, tried to manage his symptoms on his own, and his performance deteriorated as his untreated PTSD got worse. Eventually, the symptoms became severe enough that he had no choice but to get help, and when he did, his clearance was suspended during a review to determine whether his condition made him a security risk. The suspension lasted months, during which Michael couldn't do his job and faced financial stress that made his symptoms worse. His clearance was eventually reinstated, but the message was clear. Seeking mental health treatment was dangerous to your career, even when that treatment was necessary and effective. This punitive approach to mental health and clearance adjudications is not just cruel, it's counterproductive for national security. According to mental health advocates and security professionals, the current system incentivizes hiding problems rather than addressing them, ensures that cleared personnel suffer in silence rather than getting help, and creates exactly the kind of vulnerability, stressed, psychologically unstable people with access to secrets that the system claims to prevent. Several defense and intelligence community leaders have called for reforming how mental health is treated in clearance decisions, arguing that seeking treatment should be viewed positively as evidence of responsibility rather than negatively as evidence of instability. But change has been slow, and the current system continues to discourage help seeking in ways that harm both individual cleared personnel and potentially national security. The financial scrutiny in security clearance investigations raises different concerns about privacy and about whether the criteria being applied actually relate to security risks. Applicants must disclose detailed financial information, income, debts, assets, spending patterns. Investigators look for red flags like excessive debt, unexplained wealth, or financial instability that might make someone vulnerable to bribery or desperate enough to sell secrets. This makes sense in theory. Someone facing bankruptcy might be more susceptible to offers of money in exchange for classified information. But in practice, the financial standards applied in clearance decisions often seem arbitrary and disconnected from actual security risk. People have been denied clearances for having student loan debt, the very debt they incurred getting the education that qualified them for the jobs requiring clearances. People have been denied for medical debt from health emergencies, for having too many credit cards even when they're managed responsibly, for having made late payments years earlier even after financial situations improved. The financial standards seem designed for an era when a comfortable middle-class lifestyle was easily achievable, not for a contemporary economy where many young professionals carry significant debt and face financial precarity despite good jobs. The result is that some of the people who might be most valuable in national security roles, younger professionals with technical skills, people from working-class backgrounds who understand communities that intelligence agencies need insight into, are excluded because their financial situations don't fit outdated normative standards. Moreover, the financial scrutiny creates privacy invasions that go beyond what's necessary for security purposes. Investigators examine bank statements, credit card transactions, and spending patterns in detail. They can see not just overall financial health, but specific purchases, where you shop, what you buy, how you spend money. This level of financial surveillance is far more invasive than what private employers could legally conduct, and it's not clear that it actually improves security outcomes. Many of the most damaging spies in U.S. history, Aldrich Ames, Robert Hanssen, others, passed financial scrutiny repeatedly despite receiving large, unexplained payments from foreign intelligence services, suggesting that the financial component of background investigations is better at excluding people for having student loans than at actually catching security threats. The polygraph examinations required for certain high-level clearances raise even more troubling questions about privacy, accuracy, and coercion. Polygraphs, commonly called lie detector tests, are used by some intelligence agencies as part of their security clearance process, despite being widely discredited by the scientific community as unreliable for detecting deception. The National Academy of Sciences concluded in a comprehensive 2003 study that polygraph testing has insufficient scientific basis to be relied upon for security screening, that results are heavily influenced by examiner bias and countermeasures, and that they produce high rates of false positives while missing many actual deceptive individuals. Yet intelligence agencies continue using them, and the polygraph process creates situations where applicants can be accused of deception based on a scientifically questionable test, forced to explain innocent behaviors that triggered physiological responses, and potentially denied clearances based on polygraph results rather than actual evidence of wrongdoing. The polygraph process is also intensely invasive of privacy. Examiners ask detailed questions about every aspect of an applicant's life: sexual history, drug use, criminal activity, financial problems, foreign contacts, political views. The questions often go far beyond what's legally relevant, venturing into areas where employers would be prohibited from asking in normal hiring contexts. Applicants are connected to sensors measuring physiological responses while answering these intrusive questions, creating a coercive environment where refusing to answer is treated as itself suspicious. And because polygraph results are subjective, dependent on examiner interpretation of physiological responses that can be triggered by anxiety, nervousness, or other factors unrelated to deception, they give enormous power to examiners who may bring their own biases to evaluations. Let me be clear about something important. I'm not arguing that security clearance investigations serve no legitimate purpose or that we should eliminate them entirely. Protecting classified information that could harm national security if disclosed is a real and important goal. Some level of background investigation is reasonable to ensure that people with access to sensitive information are trustworthy and not vulnerable to coercion or blackmail. The question isn't whether we should vet people who will have access to secrets. It's whether the current system is actually achieving its security goals or whether it's become something else. An invasive surveillance apparatus that collects unprecedented amounts of personal information about millions of Americans while using subjective and often biased criteria to make career-destroying decisions. The evidence suggests the system isn't working as advertised. High-profile security breaches like Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, and Reality Winner all involved individuals who'd passed background investigations and were granted access to classified information despite red flags that should have been caught if the system was actually effective. Meanwhile, capable and loyal people like Sarah Chun are denied clearances based on ethnicity-based suspicions rather than actual evidence of divided loyalty. The system seems better at enforcing conformity and excluding people who don't fit narrow demographic or lifestyle profiles than at actually identifying security risks. This suggests we need fundamental reforms rather than just tweaking current practices. What would better security clearance investigations look like? Based on recommendations from civil liberties organizations, security professionals, and people who've gone through the process, several reforms could make the system both more effective at identifying real security risks and less invasive of privacy. First, investigations should focus on behavior and evidence rather than identity characteristics like ethnicity, political views, or lifestyle choices that don't actually correlate with security risks. Sarah Chin shouldn't have been denied a clearance because of Chinese heritage any more than someone should be denied for being gay, politically liberal, or in a non-traditional relationship. Unless there's actual evidence of divided loyalty or vulnerability, ethnicity and lifestyle shouldn't be factors. Second, mental health treatment should be treated as a positive factor, evidence of responsibility and self-awareness, rather than as automatically concerning. The current approach discourages help seeking in ways that harm both individuals and security. Third, financial standards should be updated for contemporary economic realities, recognizing that student debt and medical debt don't indicate irresponsibility or security risk. Fourth, the polygraph should be eliminated entirely given its scientific invalidity, or at minimum, its results shouldn't be the primary basis for clearance denials. Fifth, applicants should have more transparency into investigations, the ability to see what's being alleged, to confront evidence, and to correct inaccuracies before decisions are made. The current system's lack of due process makes it vulnerable to errors and biases that destroy careers. Sixth, there should be independent oversight of the clearance process to identify patterns of discrimination and bias. If Asian Americans are being denied at disproportionate rates, or if people who seek mental health treatment are systematically disadvantaged, that should be identified and corrected. Seventh, the scope of investigations should be narrowed to what's actually necessary for security purposes. Do investigators really need to know about your sex life, your political views on domestic policy issues, or what you said to a friend at a party 5 years ago? Much of what's currently investigated seems more about comprehensive surveillance than genuine security needs. These reforms would maintain legitimate security screening while reducing privacy invasions and discriminatory practices that undermine both individual rights and potentially security itself by excluding capable people and discouraging healthy behaviors like seeking mental health treatment. But implementing these reforms faces obstacles, primarily that the security establishment benefits from the current system's comprehensiveness and lack of accountability, and there's little political pressure to reform a process that most Americans know little about. Here's what you need to understand. Even if you never apply for a security clearance yourself, you're potentially affected by this system. If you have friends, family members, or colleagues who need clearances for their work, you can be interviewed by investigators and required to provide information about them. Your statements can be recorded in government files, potentially taken out of context, and used to make decisions about someone else's career without you ever knowing how your words were interpreted. You have no right to refuse these interviews, no right to legal counsel during them, and no recourse if information you provided was mischaracterized. The security clearance system extends government surveillance far beyond the applicants themselves, creating a network of compelled informants who have no choice but to cooperate. This should concern everyone who values privacy and civil liberties, regardless of whether you personally interact with the clearance system. The infrastructure built to conduct security clearance investigations, the databases, the investigative techniques, the legal authorities to compel production of records, could be repurposed for other forms of surveillance if we're not careful about maintaining oversight and limitations. History shows that surveillance powers granted for one purpose often expand to others, and that once government develops capabilities to collect information, those capabilities tend to persist and grow rather than being rolled back even when original justifications change. If this video made you think differently about security clearances, about privacy, or about the balance between national security and civil liberties, hit that like button and subscribe for more content examining how government systems actually work and how they affect ordinary people. Share this with anyone considering jobs that require clearances, anyone who's been through the process, or anyone interested in privacy and surveillance issues. Drop a comment sharing your experiences with security clearance investigations. What surprised you? What concerned you? Or what you think should be reformed? These conversations matter because security clearance policy is made largely behind closed doors by security professionals who rarely hear from the people most affected by their decisions. The question we need to wrestle with is not whether national security matters. Of course it does. The question is whether the current security clearance system is actually serving national security or whether it's become a mechanism for comprehensive surveillance of millions of Americans that collects far more information than necessary, applies subjective and biased standards to exclude capable people, and operates with minimal oversight or accountability. The answer matters not just for the 4 million people who apply for clearances, but for everyone whose information ends up in government files through investigations they never consented to, and for all of us who should care about maintaining meaningful privacy in an age of expanding surveillance. Think about that the next time someone tells you these investigations are just about protecting secrets. Sometimes protecting secrets looks a lot like spying on citizens, and knowing the difference matters.